Probably need to move the lectern back. You move the lectern back. Yeah, that way the light is on your face. Yeah.
You've got spots though, so we're fine.
Well, good evening. Welcome to the CONA, Sarasota County Council of Neighborhood Associations meeting for November 9th, 2015. My name's Kathy Benz, and I'm the current president. And I want to remind you that our meetings are videotaped by Pete Tyson right here. And he gives them to me, and I post them on our website, and he posts them to YouTube. Our website is conasarasota.org. Normally I would introduce notable members of the audience, and we have one hero here who brought us a computer, Mr. Albee.
No, actually, it's Mr. Thurman. We don't share the same.
Oh, okay.
Mr. Hoffman.
What's the last name?
Thurman.
Thurman, okay. The announcements that I have start off with December 5, CCNA is having a potluck holiday season party. And CCNA meets at the Waldameer Fire Station at 9 a.m. On Saturdays. And on November 16th, CONA will hold a fundraising event at Michael's on East Wine Cellar. You should have received your invitation. If you don't, there are invitations out on the reception desk. And if you can't attend and you'd be inclined to donate, we're very willing to accept that. This is Jerry Swarmstead, and she'll accept your payment, your checks, if you want to look her up. On December 14th, we will hold our traditional holiday party that is a potluck affair, and all are welcome. Please bring a dish for estimated for 8 people, and we'll look for you then. We won't have any business meeting. Are there any announcements from the floor by member organizations or other members of the audience? I do have a freebie that's been offered, and it's a UV bracelet that one of our board members is giving out to the members of the audience today. If you'll start to distribute these. And if you'll just pass them along during the program. If you go out into the sun, the bracelet begins to react and will tell you when you've had too much ultraviolet exposure. Tonight I want to welcome Russ Hoffman and his son, Nathan, and they're with Beautiful Ponds. Russ has quite a reputation locally for being an expert on lake, wetland, and preserve management. He's recommended by conservationists and has won awards from the Audubon Society in recognition of his environmental commitment. And they're going to discuss water features in our neighborhoods and communities. I think with the program will be about 25 minutes to half an hour, and then we'll go into questions. If you'll please welcome Russ and Nathan Hoffman.
Hello, Nathan Hoffman. Thanks again for Tim for fixing our technical glitch. We're going to be speaking to you a little bit. We're going to cover erosion, shoreline plantings, and littoral zone plantings, and nutrient management. So here we see just a bare shore, pretty sterile and very susceptible to erosion.
You need to be behind the... There you go.
Sorry about that. This is a little bit of a poor picture, but this is what most shorelines look like that are just sodded down to the shoreline, and if you lifted up that St. Augustine, it would be eroded underneath. Here's a highly eroded shore, and some of the things we're going to discuss: wind direction, velocity, soil type, water table elevation, shore slope, buffer plantings, water velocity, and aquatic plantings. So here's a highly eroded shore, and we're just going to click through a couple erosion photos, and there'll be one common factor that you'll notice in all of the photos. There's no aquatic plants or shoreline plantings, just simply sod down to the shore. This slide shows the tilapia nest. They're notorious for causing erosion. They'll make their nest right against the shoreline and undercut the bank. Plecostomus are also famous for this. More plants, better habitat, less erosion. So it's been proven that a planted shoreline will support 400% more life, whether that be stoneflies, insects, birds, bobcat, deer, like to use it as shelter. Here's a community program where we're doing a planting. We always like to get the community involved if possible.
That was a grant too.
Where was that at?
You got a microphone.
This was in Osprey, community in Osprey.
There is a grant project available now called Love Your Lakes program, and applications would be due December 15th. It's an erosion shore, similar to just that. You're planting the shorelines to prevent erosion. So here's a littoral zone that was planted. You can still see some of the algae in it, but you see that the shoreline's planted and a number of plants in the water. Looks like arrowhead and pickerel weed, I would imagine. Here's that same shoreline that you saw the community planting after 10 months. So, a noticeable difference. It really looks beautiful. Here's another, this is a mature shoreline that looks to be heavily planted with a spike rush, arrowhead, and I don't see any pickerel weed, but I would guess that it's in there. A little further down the slide, you'll notice some cattails in here. Those would be less desirable. You can see the additional height to that. So if you're in your lanai, you don't want to stop your view. And that tends to slow community support when you're blocking views. So pond buffer zones, this little buffer zone here, there's a difference in opinions on what the proper buffer zone should be. University of Florida would recommend 30 feet. In some communities that would be in your kitchen or living room, but we suggest 3 feet just as a start. So you would let this no-mow zone grow up, and what that's going to do is filter out some of the pollutants, nitrogen, phosphorus runoff from fertilizer, and it's also going to help stabilize the shoreline. Here's a buffer zone where they're doing the right thing, but the plants are too tall. So again, you're stopping the eye when you're looking out over it. Littoral zones and shorelines. Down there is a littoral zone that's not planted, and littoral zones are any shallow water really. If the sunlight's able to penetrate to the bottom, it's just going to be an algae factory. So you want to get those areas planted. The shade's going to reduce the algae growth, and also the plants are going to uptake the nutrients. It's also a responsibility. 30% of your lakes should be, the surface acreage should be a littoral zone, and they should be 100% covered. 80% would be, or 85% would be considered a failing grade, and you could be required to do reporting for the county or the state. So here's just a couple of the plants that we recommend planting. This is arrowhead. That's the arrowhead bloom. It gets a little white flower on it. We like to, this is a broadleaf arrowhead. It would also have a little white flower. We like to combine the arrowhead with the pickerel weed, which gets the purple flower, so you have kind of purple and white together. The shorelines, you would plant the golden CONA, so then you have the yellow, white, and purple together. This is bacopa, so this would be a shallow aquatic plant. It would be 4 to 6 inches tall. It would grow into the water and looks like kind of a green carpet until these flowers come on it. It does, as lakes recede in the dry season, it will still grow on the shoreline, so it's not going to kill it off. Fragrant water lily. You get more bang for your buck when you're using water lilies. You know, the arrowhead and the pickerel weed, you might cover 3 square foot per plant. A mature water lily, you're going to cover 15 square foot. So you're shading much more area at a time. And I'll pass it to Russ, and he can talk about the nutrient management.
The traditional way of managing lakes from the 50s, 60s, 70s has been to typically over-fertilize the yards, let the grass clippings go in the lake, have lakes be highly nutrient-laden, and then just come in with chemicals and kill the algae. And that chemotherapy approach has been the model for all over North America, particularly in Florida, because there's a lot of substances, particularly copper, that are highly toxic to algae. So the model has been to let the algae grow in a lake that's too sterile with not enough shoreline plants, and then kill the algae. Then what happens is that the algae dies off, becomes algae food as it decomposes, and then that cycle starts over. So the problem is that the traditional algicides have killed algae extremely effectively. The problem is that we go to the next slide, that the copper also kills the snails and the clams and the little insects and the fish and all the other things in the water that keep the water clean. So what we do is create this sort of vicious cycle of, you know, we kill the algae, we kill all the other stuff in the lake gets out of balance, so now the only thing that's growing in the lake is algae. Because algae is a very simple, very effective plant. I mean, they're single cell plants. They're very primitive, and they're very successful at reproducing. So it's with 8,000 species of algae native to Florida, 28,000 species of algae worldwide, we're never going to get rid of algae. I mean, I always tell people, think of how much chlorine we put in a swimming pool to keep the algae out of a swimming pool. Then when we go from a 10,000 gallon swimming pool to a 5 million gallon lake, you can't put enough chemicals in it to get rid of the algae all the time. So the best way that we approach it is just to mimic Mother Nature. Our goal isn't to kill the algae as much as the goal is to create a balanced ecosystem that functions the way it should. So our model has been that even if we don't understand all the principles, the more we can mimic Mother Nature, the more successful the lake will be. So shoreline plantings is probably one of the best ways we do that. And with shoreline plantings, we see that if you look at any lake, at least in the southeast United States, shorelines are thoroughly planted with trees and shrubs and herbaceous material, flowers and grasses and water lilies, aquatic plants, submerged underwater plants. So we know that Mother Nature likes lots of plants around the lakes. So we look at a stormwater pond and say, well, why don't we do the same thing? What we've been finding lately is that the bottom of the food chain, the microbes, is where we're seeing the best results for building a balanced lake. And the microbes, when we stock ponds with microbes, we're actually putting in trillions of microbes that reproduce sometimes as rapidly as every 10 minutes. So that what they're doing is competing with the algae for some of the nutrients. Let's see what the next slide is. Go back one. And go forward one from here. What we see with the whole microbial system is that everybody wants to get rid of algae. That's the biggest thing, that biggest complaint that we get in lakes. People hate algae. Nothing wrong with algae. Algae is very natural, particularly in the tropical and subtropical climates, so that a lake with algae in it isn't necessarily a sign of a polluted lake. It is definitely a sign of a high nutrient lake. Now in Florida, many lakes are naturally high nutrient here. Unfortunately, in our suburban environment, most of the nutrients in those environments are from us. They're from grass clippings being blown in the lake or blown down the storm drains, and they're from over-fertilization. So we have excessively high nutrient loads coming in from landscape practices. We've seen some research recently from the Fort Myers, Lee County area, where they looked at the blackout period for fertilizer. And one of the fellows did a research project where he was studying the effects of the county fertilizer ordinance. And they were very happy to see that the fertilizer ordinance was decreasing the nitrogen and the phosphorus in the stormwater ponds in their study area. So they were real happy with that. One of the coincidental things happened was they were doing one of their test studies where they did this test study, I think it was on October 12th, where some of the landscape companies were fertilizing early in October, because that's when the blackout stopped. And right after they fertilized, they had one of their 2 or 3 inch rains, where most of the fertilizer apparently ended up right in the lakes. So one of the things that we're recommending with homeowners is that if the association or individual homeowners have contracts with landscape companies to put fertilizer on the lawns, make a stipulation within the contract to not allow fertilization within 72 hours of forecasted rain. Now, it's very important to pick a source of where that forecast is, because there's many different forecast sources, whether it's several internet sites or a television studio. Pick one, doesn't matter which one, and just tell them if you fertilize it within 72 hours of a forecast rain, we're not going to pay for the fertilizer. That may not help everybody in the county, but it will at least help your community reduce the fertilization that goes in. The other thing happens with fertilization is that we want to create protected zones. Throughout the state, we've done pretty well with keeping fertilizer away from the edge of the lake. And whether they call it a ring of responsibility or no fertilizer zone or buffer zone or whatever the term is, we're starting to keep the fertilizer 9 feet or 10 feet or 12 feet or 15 feet, depending on the county and the ordinance. We're keeping the fertilizer away from the lake edge. That's great. But what we realized as these fertilizer ordinances are coming online is that we haven't protected the hard surface in front of your house. So what happens is that they fertilize the area between the sidewalk and the street pretty heavily. Then they fertilize the area from your house to the sidewalk relatively heavily. Then what happens with all the fertilizer that gets blown, that gets spread into the street and sidewalks, that's blown back up onto the grass and blown back, onto the grass right by the street and onto the grass next to the sidewalk. Well, what that is doing is creating zones where the fertilizer is double or triple the recommended rate during that first 1 foot or 18 inches from the street up into the grass and from the sidewalk up into the grass. So our recommendation has been don't fertilize within 2 feet of any street, and don't fertilize within 1 foot of any paved surface, driveway, sidewalks. And that's going to keep the fertilizer rate lower, because we do know that all the water is gonna run downhill. So the water closest, the grass closest to the street is gonna get some fertilizer from some fertilization from the fertilizer that's 1 foot, 2 foot, 3 feet, 4 feet up the slope a little bit. Then when we put in the factor of every time the grass is mowed, the grass clippings contain usually 2 to 4% of nitrogen. So every time your grass is mowed, we're fertilizing the grass with a tiny amount of nitrogen. And for anybody who happens to be on reclaimed water, the reclaimed water also contains nitrogen. And the nitrogen, so that every time we irrigate, we're also fertilizing the turf. So we have to reevaluate how much and how often we fertilize so that we protect our waterways, because what happens is that we realize that the water that's coming down the street goes right to the storm drain, and within 90 seconds is right in the pond behind your house. So that's the way we look at fertilization on the front to protect it. So when we get back to our model of why we're using microbes, is that microbes is the lowest level of life on the food chain, or the food pyramid. And what we see with this is that as we manipulate the microbes by adding them to your ecosystem, they're out-competing the algae for the same nutrients, and they're tying up a lot of that nutrient, nitrogen, and phosphorus in their biomass. And then some of the microbes are also able to change the nitrogen in the water, which is usually in the form of ammonia, nitrate, or nitrite, and changing that into nitrogen gas, and then that nitrogen gas goes back into the atmosphere. So what we're finding through some of the research that if we put the right microbes with the right substances in the pond, we can have a significant reduction in the overall nitrogen in the pond. Consequently, we have an overall reduction in the algae. Consequently, we're not going to put these horrible chemicals in the lake, and the whole lake is going to be healthier. The research, we just finished a 2-year research study as a partner with Cornell University in their stormwater department. And we found with 2 of the lakes that we studied here in Sarasota County, significant reductions in the overall nitrogen level in the lakes. And we're looking right now we're looking for more funding to take our research to the next level on larger scales, because we did very small scale, microbial projects. So that's what we're working on here, and recommending that associations get more involved with any type of lake management that prevents nitrogen and phosphorus from getting into the water, and more environmentally friendly methods to handle it once it is in the water. And I guess at this point, we can go to the next slide, but I look at that, we have a lot of water in Sarasota County.